There are men who spend their entire lives giving time, energy, devotion, believing that generosity will finally earn them the love they've never claimed for themselves. They don't notice the exhaustion creeping in or the quiet bitterness forming beneath their kindness. They just keep offering pieces of themselves, hoping someone will eventually see their worth. But psychology reveals a darker truth. Some men give everything not because they should, but because they're terrified of what happens if they stop. Some men walk through life believing their value exists only in what they can offer others. They say yes automatically, swallow their needs, and mistake self-neglect for strength. They don't realize how deeply they've been conditioned to earn affection through sacrifice. And while the world gladly takes what they give, almost no one stops to ask what they need in return. This is where psychology uncovers a silent pattern. How a man can give endlessly, yet feel increasingly invisible. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that grows inside a man who gives too much. Not the physical kind, but the kind that settles in the chest, somewhere between responsibility and resignation. It begins quietly, disguised as kindness, disguised as strength. A man learns early that being useful is the safest way to exist. That offering help earns acceptance. That carrying the weight of others keeps the peace. And slowly, without even noticing, he becomes the one who fixes everything except himself. Psychology describes this pattern as a behavioral loop rooted in early reinforcement. The boy who learned that love was conditional becomes a man who performs endlessly to maintain connection. But inside, a different story forms. One where every act of generosity is secretly tied to the fear of being irrelevant. A fear he never names. A fear he never shows. Because men like him don't ask for anything. They just give, hoping someone will see what they aren't saying. Over time, this turns into a quiet erosion of identity. The man who once had preferences, desires, boundaries, slowly dissolves into someone defined by usefulness. He becomes emotional scaffolding for people who rarely look up to notice what holds them. He becomes a friend who listens, the partner who stabilizes, the son who overfunctions, the co-worker who compensates. And society praises him for this as if it were noble, when often it's just survival. But psychology doesn't romanticize it. Psychology calls it self-abandonment. And the truth is brutal. A man who gives everything without receiving anything is not selfless. He is starved. He is living on a hope that reciprocity will someday appear, that someone will offer him the same emotional weight he carries for everyone else. But when that moment never comes, something inside begins to fracture, not with anger, but with a slow implosion of worth. He starts to feel invisible even in rooms where he is needed. He starts to feel empty even while helping others. He starts to feel resentment toward people who have no idea they are taking more than he can afford to lose. And that resentment scares him, because he has been taught that good men don't feel it. Good men don't break. Good men don't want anything in return. So he tells himself he's fine. He shrugs off the tension in his chest. He says, don't worry about it. Even when he wishes someone would worry, he becomes fluent in emotional minimization. It's nothing. It doesn't matter. I can handle it. And the world believes him because it wants to, but the human psyche has limits. No man can give endlessly without consequence. Eventually, the imbalance becomes too heavy. The body starts to speak in ways the voice refuses to. Fatigue, irritability, numbness, loss of joy, unexplained sadness. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals of depletion. And every time he ignores them, the emotional deficit grows. And here's where the most painful realization begins to form, not in anger, but in clarity. He has created a life where everyone receives from him, except him. A life where he is needed, but not seen. And this realization is precisely what leads us into the next layer, the modern symptom that exposes how deeply this pattern distorts a man's relationship with himself. When a man spends years giving more than he receives, something shifts in the way he moves through the world. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a shoreline eroding grain by grain. At first, he doesn't notice the cost. He thinks he's just tired. He tells himself he just needs a break, a weekend, a good night's sleep. But the exhaustion he carries is not physical. It's relational. It comes from being emotionally available to everyone except himself. Modern psychology calls this pattern a silent depletion of self-worth. But in daily life, it shows up differently. It shows up in a way he hesitates before asking for help because he's convinced it will burden others. It shows up in how he overexplains his needs, softens his words, or apologizes for taking up space. It shows up in a way he forces a smile when he feels unseen because he doesn't know how to express disappointment without feeling guilty. And eventually, the imbalance starts to infect everything he does. At work, he becomes the one who takes on the tasks no one else wants. With friends, he becomes a listener who absorbs everyone's chaos. In relationships, he becomes a partner who gives stability but receives inconsistency. And every time he adjusts himself to meet someone else's needs, a small part of him fades. This is the modern symptom: men who serve as anchor for others while drifting further from themselves. He convinces himself this is normal. He tells himself that being needed is the same as being valued. But deep down, he can feel the difference. Being needed drains him. Being valued would nourish him. And he's not receiving nourishment from anyone. So he begins to withdraw emotionally, not as a punishment, but as a survival instinct. He speaks less. He shares less. He starts to believe that his feelings are inconveniences, that he should handle it, because that's what he's always done. And over time, this self-silencing becomes automatic, almost unconscious. He doesn't even realize he's doing it. The irony is brutal. The man who gives everything is often the one who feels most alone. He walks through life with a sense of emotional debt, like he owes the world more than he has, like he must constantly earn his place. And because he rarely receives anything back, he slowly loses the ability to recognize his own emotional hunger. He doesn't know what he needs anymore. He only knows how to serve. This detachment creates a dangerous psychological loop. The less he receives, the more he gives. The more he gives, the less he feels deserving of reciprocity. He begins to believe that asking for support is a sign of weakness or failure. So he stays quiet, hoping someone will notice his fatigue without him having to say it. But people rarely do. And soon, the man who once felt strong through helping others now feels hollowed out by the one thing he thought would keep him connected: being useful. Yet this hollow space marks the doorway to the deeper truth, the one hiding beneath the surface of his generosity. Because the real question is not why he gives so much, but why he believes he must. Esse pano que nos leva ao próximo bloco. A verdadeira causa psicológica por trás desse padrão devastator. To understand why a man gives endlessly without receiving, you have to look beneath the surface, far beneath the gestures, the habits, the polite smiles he has mastered, because this pattern doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins in the earliest places where his identity was shaped, in the moments he learned that his value depended on what he could offer, not who he was. Psychologists call this a core relational script, a mental blueprint formed long before he had the language to describe what he felt. For many men, this script is written silently in childhood, in environments where emotional needs were dismissed, minimized, or punished, not with violence necessarily, but with indifference. The kind that teaches a boy that being easy, helpful, and low maintenance is safer than being honest or vulnerable. A boy quickly notices which behaviors earn approval and which make him feel like a burden. If expressing sadness leads being told to get over it, he learns to swallow it. If asking for attention is met with irritation, he learns to stop asking. If helping others earns a rare moment of praise or connection, he learns that usefulness is the closest thing to affection he will ever receive. By the time he becomes a man, this lesson is so deeply ingrained that it doesn't feel like conditioning. It feels like personality. He believes he is naturally selfless, naturally giving, naturally strong. But these traits are often masks, forged to protect him from the fear he never names. The fear of being abandoned if he stops performing. Deep inside, he carries a belief that he must earn connection. That love is not given freely. It is a transaction. And in that transaction, his side is always heavier. He must be dependable, forgiving, available, steady. He must absorb others' chaos without adding his own. He must be the emotional backbone, even when his own is cracking under the weight. This creates a psychological paradox. He gives because he wants to connect, Yet the more he gives, the less people feel the need to give back. They grow accustomed to his generosity. They assume he has no needs. They assume he is fine, and he never corrects them. Because deep down, he's terrified that if he stops being helpful, he will stop being loved. This fear is not irrational. It's rooted in developmental conditioning. When a boy learns that affection is conditional, he internalizes a message that follows him into adulthood. If I don't give, I don't matter. This belief shapes everything. It shapes how he chooses partners, often selecting people who are comfortable receiving but not giving. It shapes how he handles conflict, usually by avoiding it, afraid of pushing people away. It shapes how he talks to himself, with harshness, never compassion. It shapes how he responds to exhaustion, by working harder, giving more, try to prove that he deserves the place he already occupies. And as these patterns repeat, he slowly forgets what it feels like to have boundaries. He forgets his preferences, his limits, his desires. He becomes disconnected from his inner world, living instead through the emotional needs of others. But the psyche is not designed to be one-sided. Eventually it rebels, not with anger, but with symptoms: chronic resentment, emotional numbness, burnout, or the quiet belief that he is invisible. These symptoms are the psyche's way of saying, you cannot keep sacrificing yourself and expect to feel whole. Yet even in the midst of this collapse, the man often blames himself. He thinks he's failing because he's not strong enough to keep giving, when in reality, the system he's living in was broken from the start. He was taught to give without limits. He was taught to silence his needs. He was taught that his worth depends on what he provides, not who he is. And this is why he rarely receives anything in return. Not because he is unworthy, but because he never learned how to exist as someone who expects reciprocity. This is a psychological root. A man who learned to survive by disappearing into service. But every survival pattern has a cost. And the cost of this one is enormous. He loses himself. Not in one moment, but slowly, over years of meeting everyone's needs but his own. Yet buried beneath this exhaustion is a possibility of transformation. Not through rebellion or confrontation, but through a different kind of courage. The courage to let himself be seen. The courage to admit he has needs. The courage to stop performing and start existing. And this is where the next stage of the journey begins. Not in giving more, but in allowing himself, perhaps for the first time, to receive. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when a man realizes he can't keep living as a reservoir for other people's needs. Not because he stops caring, and not because he becomes selfish, but because something inside him begins to protest. A slow, steady whisper rising from the part of him he ignored for years. A part that has been waiting to be acknowledged, not as a burden, but as a rightful voice. This whisper often begins in the smallest moments. The instant he feels drained after saying yes will want to say no. The hollow ache that appears after giving support to someone who never once asks how he is. The strange heaviness he feels when he realizes he's surrounded by people who love what he provides, but not necessarily who he is. These sensations are not weaknesses. They are signals. The psyche's way of informing him that he has spent too long abandoning himself. Psychology calls this threshold a boundary awakening, a point where the internal imbalance becomes too great to ignore. But for a man who has built his entire identity around being useful, this awakening does not feel empowering at first. It feels terrifying, because stepping into emotional honesty requires something he was never taught to cultivate: the belief that his needs are as legitimate as anyone else's. The first step is not a confrontation. It is not a dramatic declaration. It is simply awareness, recognizing that the exhaustion he carries is not normal, not noble, and not sustainable. It is the realization that giving without receiving is not strength. It is an emotional hemorrhage, and healing begins with stopping the leak. This shift often starts with one courageous question: what do I actually feel? A question he may not have asked himself in years, maybe ever. At first, the answers come slowly. They emerge in fragments, awkward and unfamiliar. Frustration, loneliness, weariness, desire, disappointment. These emotions are not signs of inadequacy. They are evidence that he's reconnecting with the parts of himself he buried in order to be the dependable one. And acknowledging them does not make him weak. It makes him real. But awareness alone is not enough. He must unlearn the instinct to overextend himself. He must relearn the art of self-preservation. This does not mean becoming cold or withholding. It means recognizing that generosity is only healthy when it does not require self-destruction. He does not need to stop helping others. He needs to stop disappearing in the process. The turning point arrives when he understands that boundaries are not walls. They are doors. They allow people in, but not at the expense of his stability. And when he begins to set these boundaries, even in small, trembling steps, something profound happens. The people who truly value him adapt. They listen. They adjust. They meet him halfway. And the ones who don't reveal themselves. This is where the transformation deepens. Because a man who has spent his life giving everything often fears that if he stops, people will leave. But the truth is more painful and more liberating. The people who leave were never giving anything back to begin with. What remains then is not emptiness, but space. Space for healthier connections. Space for reciprocity. Space for him. As he grows more comfortable honoring his own needs, he begins to experience an unfamiliar sensation, emotional balance. Moments where he feels seen instead of merely useful. Moments where someone asks how he is, and he doesn't answer reflexively, but honestly. Moments where he realizes he doesn't have to prove his worth through effort. His presence alone is enough. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds slowly, like strength warming back into a limb that had gone numb. And along the way, he discovers something he never expected. Giving feels better when he is no longer empty. Connection feels deeper when it moves in both directions. And receiving does not weaken him. It completes him. The man who once lived as an endless provider finally recognizes that reciprocity is not a luxury. It is a requirement for emotional survival. And in claiming that truth, he steps into a version of himself that is stronger, not because he carries everyone, but because he finally carries himself. Before, he gave because he feared loss. Now he gives because he chooses to. Before, he disappeared into service. Now, he stands in his own presence. Before, he lived in emotional poverty. Now, he begins the long, necessary work of reclaiming emotional dignity. And this journey, raw, unsettling, transformative, marks the beginning of a new story. Not one where he stops caring, but one where he is finally. Before you leave, take a moment. If any part of the story felt familiar, if something you shifted, even slightly, let it be the start of your own reconstruction. And if this message reached you in a way others never have, consider leaving a comment, sharing your experience, or simply saying what resonated. It helps more than you think. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden corners of the male psyche, the wounds, the strength, the unspoken truths, subscribe and activate notifications. There's more to uncover, and you don't have to walk that path alone.